I've known Jehon for many, many years, and he and Fred Rosenbaum are the face of adult education for Northern California with a wonderful organization, Lehrhaus Judaica. He is an expert on many, on archaeology, but in particular, certain regions of the planet, and often leads trips where he provides historic background. And going to Mexico and learning more about Jewish Mexico would be high on my list if I was traveling globally these days, which I'm not yet. In any event, do ask your questions with the chat function. And now it's our pleasure, Jehon Grist in Digging Jerusalem.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am a great fan of online education and have been using it both in the previous Lehrhaus and the current Lehrhaus for over a decade now. It is a saving grace. It proved to be more than a saving grace than any of us expected because of COVID. But it means that we've changed a lot of things. For example, this class, but also for our Mexico City tour, we provide tour participants with a 4-session online course, a recorded online course of the history of Mexico and the history of the Jews of Mexico, and introductions to the sites of our itinerary. So I enjoy this medium, and I hope you will too. We're going to take a look at First and Second Temple period archaeology in Jerusalem and the immediate area. There have been, especially when I was a graduate student many years ago, claims that there was just too precious little being found from the biblical period, First and Second Temple period, or let's put it 1000 BCE to 70 of the Common Era. There's so little found that maybe all this stuff about the kings of Israel and Judah is just a bunch of baloney. There are a number of revisionist scholars who tried that back in the 90s, even into the early years of this century. We now know better. And so my task for this session is twofold. First off, we're going to take a look at some of the important pieces of evidence that address the First and Second Temple period presence of biblical Jerusalem by Israelites, and a little later on, Judeans. We'll talk about terminology in a minute. And then in the second part of the class, towards the end, I'll be discussing what the consequences of these discoveries are. And that brings us into the rather murky realm of the politics of biblical archaeology, where people do some of the best things for the worst reasons and some of the worst things for the best reasons. More on that a little later. So let's start by defining periods and terms. For the archaeology of Jerusalem, we can, for our purposes, conveniently color code it. We first off have the Canaanite period. I subscribe, and most scholars do now, to the understanding that the Canaanites were our ancestors and that we grew out of them as our religious ideas developed. And that begins, we think, somewhere around 1200 BCE. So all of these periods, archaeological periods, early, middle, and late Bronze Age, are what scholars in the field use. And the late Bronze Age concludes around 1200 BCE. For our purposes, we're going to be focusing on the First Temple period, which is color-coded in blue, the latter part of Iron 1, starting around 1000 BCE, and then the full extent of Iron Age period 2, when Jerusalem was the capital of the independent kingdom of Judah. And there was a separate kingdom in the north, which was usually called Israel, but sometimes it had other names, like Ephraim, one of our tribes. And for Jerusalem, we move into the Second Temple period after the destruction of Solomon's temple in 586 BCE. When Solomon's temple falls, we have a real watershed moment, and that's covered by the color-coded areas I have here as brown, the Second Temple period. There's not a whole lot we know about the early Second Temple. We'll be talking more about that in a minute. But there is some. And for the later Second Temple, especially the one built by Herod the Great, we know a great deal, and we're discovering more just about every minute. All right. So what's in a name? Well, just to try to keep things straight, and this may be a bit oversimplified, what's in a name is the series of names used to describe our ancestors over a period of time. Legitimately, we could be called the Hebrews or part of the Canaanite world from about 1800 to 1200 BCE. We may have had a local god, El, and of course, that's one of the names used for God in our Hebrew Bible. But it was still a formative period, and we normally associate this period with the age of the patriarchs and matriarchs described in the book of Genesis. The next one, Israelites or Judeans. Well, during that very brief window of the United Kingdom of Israel under David and Solomon, probably a little less than 80 years, and yet we call it the Golden Age, there was one country from north to south. But after Solomon died, Israel broke up into two countries, Judah in the south, with its capital in Jerusalem, and Israel, or sometimes called Ephraim, as I mentioned before, in the north, ultimately with its capital at Samaria, in what is now the West Bank. So we have, for this period, two different groups, and since we're focusing on Jerusalem, we're going to be focusing on the Judeans, the kingdom of Yehuda or Judah, and that covers a period of about 1200 to 520 BCE, a little after the destruction of Solomon's temple. When the exiles, and it was multiple exiles, forced by the Babylonian conquerors of the kingdom of Judah, were allowed to come back by the new Persian administration, we actually can begin to call these Judeans Jews, because monotheism, the worship of one God, was becoming dominant at this point. Monotheism did exist earlier when the kingdom of Judah still stood, but it was even then in the developmental stage. The whole idea of putting away all the gods and goddesses in the region that a good many of us believed in, it took a while. And with returning exiles from Babylon between 539 and 520 BCE, we have this point where new religious leadership really begins to drive home the idea of monotheism. So we'll start off with tales of the First Temple period. Some of the period, especially the last couple of centuries before 586, some of this period is really well attested in Jerusalem by archaeological discoveries. The earlier part is now beginning to show some very important new evidence that we'll be talking about at least a little bit. So we're going to start out in the area of Ir David. Now, in the dotted line that you see here, we have the walls of the old city of Jerusalem. So if you've ever been to Jerusalem, you know what I'm talking about, but it's the eastern end of what you would call Greater Jerusalem today, if you haven't been there. Pretty close to the southeastern corner, we have the area of the Western Wall, right here, where my pointer is showing. Ir David is just on the other side of the wall, across the street, in a village neighborhood, a Palestinian village neighborhood known as Silwan. I spent quite a bit of time as a graduate student at Hebrew University roaming around it. Of course, that was back in the day when, yeah, you could. But since I left as a graduate student, excavations here have really multiplied a number of times over, both for perfectly understandable scientific reasons, but also for reasons of politics. We'll be touching on that a little bit later on. When you take a look at the physical layout of the area around Jerusalem, you very quickly learn that it is a spine of land, a fairly steep spine for the biblical period, that was bounded by what in the classical period we call the Tyropoan Valley, and on the eastern side, the Kidron Valley. And very near the edge of the Kidron Valley was the Gihon Spring. This was the fresh water supply for Jerusalem for many, many centuries. If water is what water access is what makes an ancient city work, the Gihon Spring was our lifeline. From the Middle Bronze Age into the time of the reigns of Kings David and Solomon, the town was pretty small, no more than 1,000 to 2,000 people crammed into a very steep and limited space. And ultimately, what changed it in the reign of Solomon was the extension of this northern high place area for the building of Solomon's temple, somewhere around 960 BCE. Over time, the town would expand, and so would its walls, across the Tyropoan Valley. This was especially true in the time of King Hezekiah, around 700 BCE. And we know this part, which I guess you could compare to a suburb, as the Mishneh portion of biblical Jerusalem. So this overhead photo emphasizes what was really the heart of biblical Jerusalem from about David's time all the way up to the time of Hezekiah. That's about 1000 to 700 BCE, nearly 3 centuries. We call this area Ir David, the city of David, because that is our reference point for it. Now, most other people use a different term, either Jerusalem, or if you speak Arabic, it's Al-Quds, which in Arabic means the holy. But for us, we recognize this portion, which is right in here that I'm circling as Ir David, the city of David. This is where the most important excavations, the most revealing excavations of the last 50 years or so have been conducted. Excuse me. One area that has been claimed to be the building work of David is what we call the Milo. It's this stepped stone structure that is actually a kind of revetment. It holds up a plateau area, and it's on that plateau area that other structures, perhaps dating to the time of David and Solomon, were built. So there's a good chance that this area was built in the reign of David, maybe the reign of Solomon, to prepare for more advanced administrative and royal buildings a little farther up. It's also possible, thanks to the excavations of Yigal Shiloh back in the 70s, that this was actually a revetment that was built by folks called the Jebusites. They were the previous Canaanite owners of Jerusalem, if you will, the ones from whom David conquered the city of Jerusalem somewhere around 1000 BCE. Our biblical evidence helps us, but again, just because the biblical text says it's so, you really need to try to be sure of that. And that's one thing archaeologists belabor themselves with. David lived in the stronghold and called it the city of David, Ir David, which is why we call it that today. And David built the city all around the Milo, that's this structure right here, inward, which means farther up the hill. And another note from the book of Kings, Pharaoh's daughter went up from the city of David to her own house that Solomon had built for her. Then he built up the Milo. The biblical text suggests that he built it, but what was really meant by the writer, we believe, was that Solomon expanded the Milo. So this structure here may well be some of our most concrete evidence of the earliest First Temple leaders, David and Solomon. What makes this even more interesting is excavations from the mid-1990s into the first decade of the 21st century. They were conducted by Eilat Mazar. Both she and I were graduate students at Hebrew University back in the day, and I got to talk to her a couple of times about her work. Her excavations here, and sadly, I have to say she passed away last year. She had a very stressful task excavating an extremely controversial site. Her excavations revealed monumental buildings. We'll be looking a little bit more at that in a minute. And from the pottery and other evidence, she was reasonably sure, and a good many scholars agree with her, that the dating for that building was around 1000 BCE, or maybe a little bit later. In other words, the time of David and Solomon. However, if she's off by only 50 years and it was built 50 years earlier, then it would be a Jebusite, Canaanite construction. So we're still working on that problem. And it's one that has driven a lot of controversy, a few fists thrown here and there. And unfortunately, Eilat had to suffer with that quite a bit. From her excavations, this section shows a portion of the monumental building that she's talking about. And from it, a number of things were found, including ivory implements. These look like kitchen implements that do belong to the First Temple period, beyond question. But from the 10th century BCE, when David and Solomon were around, or maybe the 9th or 8th, that's still an open-ended issue. On top of that, there were other architectural features that indicate that this large building wasn't just any large building. You'll notice over on the left, a capital. We call it the Proto-Aeolic capital. And it was standard issue for monumental buildings in early Israel, from the 10th century all the way down to the very early 6th century. If you were building something that administratively was important or was the residence of royalty, it would probably have pillars supported by these capitals. In addition, some very nice pottery produced in Cyprus, as you can see what's left of it here, and other pottery that's of approximately the same date range support the idea that this monumental structure belongs to the 10th century. We also found something, actually more than one thing, a number of seal impressions that come from stone seals that are inscribed. So this is actually a copy of the inscription. It comes from somewhat later. It actually mentions a character named Yehukal, one of the more obscure characters of the Hebrew Bible, but not to the folks in our reading biblical Hebrew class this last semester. Yehukal served King Zedekiah, the last king of Judah, just before the destruction of Jerusalem and Solomon's temple by the Babylonians in 586 BCE. And it is one of a good many scarabs that have been found from this last few decades of Jerusalem's existence. There's another one, a seal impression from the excavations of Yigal Shiloh again, of Gemaryahu ben Shaphan. He also served Zedekiah's administration, and we hear about both of them in Jeremiah 36 and 37. So for those of you at a class with me, this may be a bit of a rerun, but nonetheless, it's an important indicator that certainly by 600 BCE, there was absolutely no question. Jerusalem was a Judean town with documents written in Hebrew. It wasn't somebody else's town, and it probably hadn't been somebody else's town since the time of Solomon and David. So moving just a little bit over to the Temple Mount, now we're inside the eastern end of the old city of Jerusalem. This is, of course, where the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque are, but it is also believed to be the place where all of our temples were. Solomon's temple, the early Second Temple from about 520 to 20 BCE, 500 years, and then Herod's temple, which was really the third temple. Looking at the Temple Mount from the air, most scholars argue that the original location of all three of those temples was where the Dome of the Rock is. And of course, right on that basis alone, you can pretty understandably get the idea that the Palestinians would first and foremost say, oh, there never was a temple of the Jews here. They have their interests in doing this, and we'll cover that in a little bit more detail later on. There is an alternative site, which I've always found fascinating. It was suggested about 50 years ago, and it's never gained any traction, but I think it's still a possibility. That instead of being where the Dome of the Rock is, it's actually next to a little cupola, a domed cupola, that is named in Islamic tradition as the cupola of the tablets. In other words, somewhere in ancient Islamic lore, they understood the temple and the Holy of Holies and the tablets of the law to be located there. But generally speaking, there's not much discussion on that one. What did Solomon's temple look like? Well, there's not a stone of it left that we know of. In fact, there's not a provable stone of the structure of any of the three temples left. So here we're working from guesswork and comparative analysis of contemporary temples. But what we do know is that it was a three-chambered structure, a portico area known in Hebrew as the Olam, the main chamber where offerings of incense would be made and prayers would be observed, the Heichal, the Holy of Holies, or Devir, and then wrapping around the structure was basically an annex that was used to store temple ritual equipment and supplies. So even though we don't have any of this, do we have any evidence of temples like this from the same time? And the answer there is yes. At Ain Dara in Syria, sadly destroyed by the Islamic army back about 10 years ago, Ain Dara revealed a temple also dating to the 10th century BCE that had three main sections and was surrounded by storerooms on three sides. And on top of all of that, it's about the same dimensions as Solomon's temple. And so you may be saying to yourself, well, were temples like this common? Increasingly, we are discovering that with size variations, true, nonetheless, the basic plans were quite similar. And so then you'd say, well, that's a little tricky. Didn't God authorize the building of it? Didn't the Israelites build it themselves? The answer is no, the Phoenicians did. Now, you may say I'm being troublesome and overly scientific, but the Bible tells us so. And in the book of 1 Kings, we very clearly understand that Hiram, the king of Tyre, and also another Hiram who was involved in working on the building of the temple, they did most of the work. So in other words, these temples were built according to a fairly standard plan of the time, and ours in Jerusalem was built largely by the Phoenicians. So what evidence do we have of this if we don't have the buildings? 2 years ago, a very interesting item was found that for most of us would just be ignored. But this is a 2 shekel weight, 23 grams, very precisely accurate. It wasn't used as a coin, but it was used for weighing materials in the marketplace in the immediate area of Solomon's temple. Some scholars think it dates all the way back to the 10th century BCE. I'm a little more skeptical, but certainly within 200 or so years of that time. Why would you have something like that there? Precisely because since it was near the temple and offerings from all over the country were brought to the temple, or they were purchased in Jerusalem to be given to the priests, you need weights like this in the immediate area of the temple. And that continued to be a tradition for centuries in the area of the Temple Mount. Okay. So let's move a couple of hundred years forward. What do we know about Jerusalem in the time of Hezekiah, who is regarded by many scholars as the first major reformer towards a monotheistic faith, a rejection of the Judean worship of other deities, including God's wife at the time, who's known as Asherah? Well, Hezekiah did a great deal to strengthen Jerusalem, to prepare it for his breakaway from being a vassal of the Assyrian Empire. He built a 1/3 mile long underground water tunnel that ended at what we call today the Siloam Pool. And it may well be that a few of you have been there and walked through. It's quite an adventure. We actually know that this was an achievement of Hezekiah because there was an inscription in the water tunnel. You can see it over on the left. That reads about the completion of the excavation of the tunnel that would bring the water of the Gihon spring completely within the walls of Jerusalem. So when the Assyrians attacked Jerusalem, they wouldn't have a drop of water, which explains why in Isaiah chapters 37, I believe it is, we have the story of how the Assyrians besieged Jerusalem, but one night an angel of the Lord came down and killed the entire army. Well, it was more likely that they were dying of thirst or dysentery, but either way, they died quickly and the siege was broken. The inscription is one our biblical Hebrew class actually translated some years ago, and it's a really interesting one. It talks about the point where they were right next to each other, digging towards each other from two different directions, and how they could hear the picks hitting at the stone until they finally met. It's quite a story. It's in perfect biblical Hebrew, what we call Paleo-Hebrew of the time, which can be dated itself on paleographic grounds to within 50 years of Hezekiah's time. So it's extremely likely that the biblical text here really does explain what was going on. And it also verifies, if you will, at least a good many of the features of the story in Second Kings. Now, there is this problem about just how religiously monotheistic we were in the time of Hezekiah. This is another one of those seal impressions known as a bulla. And on the inscription, you can see not only Hezekiah's name, but also you can see a winged solar disk. My. Was that an icon of Israelite religion at the time? Yes, it was. Where did they get it from? They got it from Egypt. Were Egyptian religious ideas and iconography used extensively by neighboring states, including biblical Judah and Israel? You betcha. And the question comes up, well, how strict was their belief in one God? Yod-He, Vav-He, if you will, which is horribly mispronounced as Jehovah. That's why I'm not afraid to say it. The text reads, belonging to Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, his father, king of Judah. So right off the bat, Hezekiah was there. Other seals like this, a fairly large number, have been found for the period of the later 8th into the beginning of the 6th century BCE. There is absolutely no question whatsoever that during this entire period, this was a Judean town. At the very end of Jerusalem's ancient existence under the Solomonic temple, we have Achiel's house, another area excavated by Yigal Shiloh, one of my heroes when I was a grad student at Hebrew University. He was a paratrooper, tough as nails, did tend to have accidents like falling off of the edges of excavated areas, but he'd always recover quickly. Unfortunately, he died of cancer in 1987, and that was a great loss to the archaeological community. In any case, he was a great archaeologist. And one of his assistants, who was a friend of mine, David Tarler, actually excavated the area of Achiel's, as we say politely in Hebrew, Beit Shimush, literally the house of use. In other words, it's the WC. And you can see what's going on here. When this was excavated, archaeologists realized immediately that this was virgin, that no one had come to this toilet since 586 BCE. So they brought in their paleobiology and paleobotany teams and took a look at what was underneath the opening that you see, the throne, if you will. And they found out that the diet of the folks of Jerusalem during the Babylonian siege in 588 to 586 included insects and lizards and weeds and whatever else they could get their hands on. In other words, they were starving to death during the siege. And for those of you who took my class on Jeremiah this last semester, this is proof positive that the situation was as desperate as both the books of Jeremiah and the book of Lamentations suggests. Go back about 20 years, and there's a discovery just outside the old city walls. Since it was a cemetery, that made sense. You didn't bury within the walls. We know the location today is Ketef Hinnom. It's right behind the Menachem Begin Center, if you've ever been to the Begin Center. And until relatively recently, even though it's an incredibly important discovery, it was ignored by every tourist who came by, except, of course, for the groups that I led. So let's take a look at this. The Ketef Hinnom burials date to somewhere beginning around 610, maybe a little bit earlier BCE, and probably right up to and perhaps including the period of the destruction of Jerusalem and its immediate aftermath. This particular complex of rooms off a forecourt entrance had burial benches, if you will. And it was so sophisticated in its design that they designed head-size openings so that each deceased would be placed here in each of the spaces. We have archaeologists playing that role at the bottom left. This is a reconstruction now at the Israel Museum that shows roughly what one of these chambers, like this one right here, would have looked like with all the pottery that archaeologists found in it. There's no question about the dating, and one of the things that locks in the dating, including some arrowheads that we know can be traced to the Babylonian army, not our army, are some silver inscriptions, or inscriptions engraved in silver, rolled into a little cylinder, stick a string through it, you wrap it around the neck of the deceased. He or she takes this with him or her. And the text includes passages that are dead ringers for some of the most important verses we have in our Hebrew Bible, including some others that are certainly consistent with early biblical texts. Let's see, keeps his covenant towards those who love him and those who keep his commandments, the eternal blessing more than any snare and more evil. More redemption is in him, for Yod-Heh Vav-Heh is our restorer. May Yod-Heh Vav-Heh bless you. May he keep you. May Yod-Heh Vav-Heh make his face shine upon you. Does that sound familiar? It should. That little passage right there is the oldest text we have from the Hebrew Bible, 600 BCE. And what that means is that that text, and probably a good many others that would later become standard in our Hebrew Bible, were already well developed. This is what you took with you, if you have means, when you passed on into God's grace and mercy. And this also really puts the light of the idea that biblical Israelites didn't believe in an afterlife or in God's loving care of their conscious beings on the other side. They did. And that strikes many modern Jews as a little bit surprising. The man who made all of this possible was Gabi Barkai, who was a guest speaker for one of our tours. He's lots of fun, very quiet and soft-spoken, but he can have a mean sense of humor. And this was his biggest discovery, but not the only one, as you'll find out. Perhaps the biggest piece of evidence of Jerusalem archaeology from this First Temple period is something that everybody can see every time they go to the Jewish border. It's Hezekiah's Broad Wall, discovered in the excavations of Binyamin Mazar. And yes, it's the same Mazar family as Eilat Mazar. Binyamin Mazar found this wall, and he made it very clear once he had found it and delineated it and proven that it comes from the general period of Hezekiah. And we know Hezekiah built extra wall reinforcements at this time. he insisted that instead of building apartment buildings in the newly captured, cleared, and rebuilding of the Jewish quarter of the Old City after the Six-Day War, he made sure that this area would remain open to the sky. I've led at least half a dozen tours to Israel, and I've always taken my students when we went to the Jewish quarter to this place. And I tell them, and it's a bit of a shock to them, I think, I tell them, if you really want to pray at a wall, this is the wall that you should pray at, because it saved us 2,700 years ago from the Assyrians. And it's true. The Western Wall we pray at now, a section of Herod's retaining wall, was not a wall that ever saved us from the Romans or anybody else, but this one did. All right, first temple. There's really a lot more to tell you than this, but I only have so much time. So now we're going to move on to the second temple and do a little defining. The early second temple was completed somewhere between 520 and 515 BCE, and it stood with changes and improvements and maintenance over the years for about 500 years, until Herod the Great decided, I can do better than this. And so he had priestly laborers take down the old temple stone by stone, and then completely rebuilt the temple. And it became one of the marvels of the ancient world, not because it was the largest temple in the classical world, but because it was so brilliantly, beautifully built in an area where people could see it from miles around. So that's Herod's temple, and it stood more or less from about 20 BCE to 70 of the Common Era when, yeah, the Romans destroyed it. That temple and all of Jerusalem in Herod's era is beautifully rebuilt as a model at the Israel Museum today. And it's just a wonderful place to learn an enormous amount in a very short time. This is the entrance facade of that temple. It would have looked something like this in the time of Herod the Great. What's really interesting on this score is that about 10 years ago, Israeli archaeologists discovered on the outskirts of Jerusalem the quarry where the golden limestone of which Herod's temple was made was actually quarried. It has all the quarry marks and pottery and other dating indicators make it very clear this is where most of the stone for Herod's temple came from. Okay. For our purposes, what I'm going to do now is to optimize the Zoom coverage for this video clip. It's a silent clip, and I may stop it somewhere along the line. It may be a little bit jerky, but the important thing is that I'm going to try to make it as smooth as possible. This was produced by a group of digital illustrators at UCLA, and I've always found it fascinating. This is the southern approach path or stairway to the Temple Mount from the southern side. It would ultimately lead to Robinson's Arch, that's what we call it today, which would allow you to go all the way up to the Temple Mount level. We're going to be going up this pathway and then by Robinson's Arch and then up to the area of the Stoa. In the Greco-Roman world, this would be the market area. But it had other purposes as well in the first century. And then we'll stop and take a look at Solomon's Temple. Okay, first things first, let's optimize for video. And here we go. Now, I should mention in passing that this stairway has been partially excavated by Israeli archaeologists in the last 10 years. And that has led to a great deal of controversy. We'll be talking about that a little later on. There's Robinson's Arch. It was discovered by Edward Robinson, an American scholar, in 1839, give or take a year. He is to many, the father of American biblical archaeology. And so going up the stairs, oh, and we'll also be visiting this area down here in a minute. This is the stoa. We've now come up to the top of the stairs and the entrance to the level of the temple. And it certainly was a masterpiece. Interestingly enough, another excavation of Gabi Barkai has actually given us samples of the tiles that were used in this structure right next door to the temple of Herod itself. Okay, there we go. All right, good. All right, you're all back now. So here at the Temple Mount, you can see a perimeter wall structure. This perimeter wall structure was part of the boundary point for visitors. If you were not Jewish, that is, if you were in the area we're standing in right now, this is as close as you could get to the temple. If you were Jewish, especially if you were a Jewish male, you could go through the main entrance right over here and get fairly close to the stairway ultimately that would lead up to the slightly elevated area where the temple structure proper was located. We know that non-Jews were not allowed to come inside this perimeter area, which archaeologists know as the temenos. By that, what is inside this wall, the temenos wall, is what is kadosh, not just holy, but the root meaning of Kuf Dalet Shin is set apart. Everything within these walls was set apart for divine use. And so it should not be profaned by folks who didn't know what Jewish law was and who were not Jews. And we can actually call them Jews now. That term Judean did refer to kind of the last phase of our Israelite existence. But once we get into the Second Temple period, especially into the time of King Herod, we have a Judean province of the Roman Empire, that basically observed all of the essential practices of Orthodox Judaism today. You couldn't quite say that a few centuries before, but by the first century, you could. And one of the reasons we know this is because of all the evidence, everything from mikvahs to housewares, that indicate a pretty strict observance of kashrut. Another way that we know that non-Jews were not allowed is that over 100 years ago, proto-archaeologists discovered inscriptions in Greek that were publicly displayed around the area of the Temple Mount saying, don't you dare try to go inside those walls. The penalty for it could be death. And so this was the occupying power's way of saying we need to respect the sanctity of this particular monument to this particular group of believers known as Jews. Okay. There we go. Oh, had enough of that. Now here's a bird's eye view of the whole area. We, in our little walk, went along this path all the way up through Robinson's Arch, through the Stoa, and then to about this area right here to look at the temple complex within the walls. Now, the next question you might be asking is, well, okay, what about the folks inside the temenos walls, the priests? Where do they live? We're pretty sure they lived in an area known as the Herodian Mansions, also excavated by Binyamin Mazar in the late 60s and early 70s. My first trip to Israel, I visited the Jewish quarter when they were still cleaning things up and when they were also finishing excavations. So I got to see the area of the Herodian Mansions complex while it was still open to the sky and covered with dust. But you, if you choose to go, will have a more comfortable experience. What you're going to find is that the priestly leadership class was A, wealthy, and B, loved Greco-Roman culture. So with the exception of not portraying images within their household, they would follow all of the artistic themes that the pagan Greco-Roman world thought were attractive, including wave patterns. And yes, indeed, there's a swastika buried in there. Back in ancient Greece, it was considered a very important geometric symbol. These mosaic floors were actually designed to be an expression in stone of what their carpets looked like. The tables also are very Greco-Roman in style. So we know that they were kind of living, they were getting their cake and ate it too. Of course, they could observe strict kashrut, but they could also have an affluent Roman style of life. One way we know that they were observing the rules was that in the area of these mansions, there were at least 5 mikvahs excavated. And you can see a couple of them within the Herodian Mansions Museum complex. Now, mikvahs assure ritual purity. And of course, the priests needed that because they'd take about a 7-minute walk up to the Temple Mount and then, they'd be on the job and they needed to be ritually pure. But what if you just wanted to take a bath? You could do that. Again, this was something that well-to-do Romans would have in their homes. And so if it was just a matter of getting clean, not pure, you'd use this room. There's one museum, actually there are quite a few around here that most tour groups don't visit, and that's a shame. I could take you to the corner of one of the walls that was attacked by the Babylonians in 586. That museum location is right about here. But we're going to go to the burnt house. And the burnt house was within the same neighborhood as the Herodian Mansions, probably a continuation of it. These houses were built very closely and tightly together. Some of them had second stories. There were very narrow alleyways that would allow you to get from one place to another, but it was cramped quarters, just luxurious cramped quarters. And at the burnt house, we run into all kinds of utensils, including carefully carved stone cooking and drinking ware that observe the requirements of kashrut as we understand from one of the tractates of the Mishnah for the period, the Mishnah dating to around the 2nd to 3rd centuries of the Common Era, precisely for the purpose of recording what the early rabbis back in the time when the temple still stood had established as rules for kashrut and other areas of strict Jewish observance. We call it the burnt house because the Romans were here and they wiped the place out. In fact, we have the evidence of a spear, what was left of a steel spear, and right next to it, the forearm of a person who was identified as a young woman, probably 18 to 25 years of age. And so she was killed by the Romans, directly or indirectly, during the final siege of Jerusalem. The burnt house and so many of the other discoveries that have been made in Jerusalem for the 1st century of the Common Era largely corroborate what Flavius Josephus said about the final siege of Jerusalem in 70 of the Common Era. We do have 2 extraordinary witnesses to these 2 great destructions. The destruction of the Temple of Solomon in 586 BCE and the destruction of the Temple of Herod in 70 of the Common Era. And one comes from Josephus, and one comes from Jeremiah, and a few other observers from the age of Jeremiah. And increasingly, the archaeological evidence really supports what they had to say. And I should point out that there's a difference between trying to prove the Bible and seeing where the Bible actually is saying something that can be proven in the archaeology. That's the approach that professionals use. There are, of course, plenty of people who are more interested in finding discoveries that prove the veracity of the Bible and therefore the strength of the text. The text is strong enough. It's a matter of what you use it for that really counts. When you approach the Temple Mount from the south, as we did in that video, you find yourself about to take an incredibly, I don't think I could make those stairs anymore. I'm a bit too old for that. Well, you take your time, you finally get to the top, and then you could go inside the Temple Mount area. Here's the Stoa, here's the temple, here's the Antonia fortress, where the Romans would hang out and kept the peace. That way they could very carefully watch, at least to a certain extent, what was going on in the Temple Mount. We're going to go into the area inside the square, actually the area under Robinson's Arch. It's all part of what we now call the Davidson Archaeological Center, and part of the larger complex that is collectively now being called Ir David. Some of the most important discoveries, including those initiated by Eilat Mazar, came from the purchase of the Givati parking lot. It had originally been owned by Palestinians, this whole area. It was purchased and it was thoroughly excavated. And there have been unfortunate consequences for some of the people who live in the area. We'll talk about that in a minute. So now we're at the base of Robinson's Arch, right here. And this whole area, even though it is an arch base, actually the masonry is designed to have hollow areas that are actually shopping fronts, little stores for offerings you can take to the priests or other items that you might want when you make your pilgrimage to Jerusalem. This is all of the arch that's left. But Edward Robinson, when he saw this, being fully versed in the writings of Josephus and other contemporary writers, he knew that this was the arch that supported the main southern approach, the main southern stairway to the Temple Mount. By the way, there's my daughter, Katie. I took her to Israel in 1991 and probably bored her to death with all the archaeology, but well, you know, that's what dads do. Well, if they're archaeologists anyway. So from one of our tours, you can see the little shop entrances here. Of course, the arch is now long gone, but that's where we are over here in the bottom middle section. One of the things you would probably buy in this particular region would be turtle doves or some kind of bird that was acceptable for offering by the priests to God in the temple. And this is also part of the Davidson Archaeological Park. So where would they get the turtle doves? We know where they got them, from a site called Tel Marisha, which is, maybe 20 miles away from Jerusalem. But it had a columbarium, not the burial kind, the kind to raise doves and pigeons and such as that. One of those would make a nice meal for someone, but it could also be purchased for an offering to God. This is the part that you can no longer see in the area that we were just in. It once was a main marketing street with a covered pillared area to give shade to the, what would you call it, the shoppers who would ply through the street, getting what they needed or just taking in the scene. This is what's left of that street, and it was excavated in 1968, 69. It remained visible for folks who visited the Davidson Center. And then unfortunately, there was this decision that it really wasn't safe the way it was. But this is what the street looks like because of the huge top stones from the retaining wall, the Herodian Temple Mount wall, that were pushed down by the Romans at the very time of the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. And so, as you can see, the road was completely bashed in. And as you can guess, with all the fleeing Jerusalemites trying to get as far away from the Romans as possible, this is where a lot of the Jerusalemites ended up being crushed. This story came to light in the excavations. And one of the professors I studied with at Hebrew University remembered working there and said, when we got to this point, we looked at these craters and we started crying because we knew what this was. This was revealing the moment of the Roman destruction of the Temple Mount area. And of course, the Romans leveled the Temple Mount as well. But when everything was still in place, at the top of the Temple Mount was a fence or perimeter wall at the very southwestern edge of the Temple Mount. And it would be here that one of the temple staff would blow the horn to announce the coming of Shabbat, 18 minutes or something like that, before Shabbat actually began. And from this very place, he would also blow the announcement that Shabbat was over, Motzei Shabbat. And he would know where to go because there was a little recess for him to stand. So he could be right on the edge and his trumpet would be heard everywhere. And just in case he wasn't absolutely certain, there was an inscription, Levet HaTekiyah, and we don't have the remaining letters. But some scholars have suggested that it was Kariz. Kariz means announcement. And so the announcement of Shabbat via the tekiyah, or the blowing of the horn. Okay. So now we're going to be going into the last part of our discussion. And it's the one that brings up a large number of issues, not necessarily issues that would always make us feel good about our own work in discovering our biblical heritage, but nonetheless, important issues to be considered. I know that a couple of months ago, you had a presentation from, I think it was David Lawler, about underground Jerusalem. And my sense was that there were some folks who felt that Lawler was skeptical of the Jewish presence, or at least the Judean/Israelite presence in Jerusalem from about 1000 BCE for several centuries forward. My whole job so far is to tell you, you don't have to worry about that one. And I'm not sure that Lawler was necessarily interested in saying that that's all a bunch of fiction. It's not a bunch of fiction. It is archaeologically proven. But one thing he really does spend a lot of time on his book, and I've read most of it now, is the whole issue of what the consequences of digging are for the modern world. And this kind of thing, both legal and illegal digging in the Jerusalem area, has been going on, for 150 years or so. And it will probably continue for some time to come. Here's the thing. However much we've done for reasons other than trying to discover the past objectively, and by that I mean proving Israel's priority in, or modern Israel's priority in holding the land, I can tell you that the other side has done roughly the same thing. In fact, as I mentioned at the very beginning, this is something that just goes on and on and on. It happens in many countries. Since I'm half Egyptologist, I can tell you that Zaki Hawass, who was the semi-deified leader of Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities, Zaki Hawass went on an excavation craze, which the Egyptian government is still supporting, to excavate everything in sight, so that every week or so, honestly, this is what it is, they'll have an international news release talking about the greatest discovery ever in Egypt. Come to Egypt and see. And so the Egyptians, they know that the land of the pharaohs can really be a cash cow. And up to a point, that's perfectly understandable. And there is the plus that all of this archaeological discovery, even if sometimes it's rushed, and sometimes it is rushed, is leading to more and more scientific understanding of the lives of the ancient Egyptians. So this is a case where the Egyptians are doing the right thing in a way for all the wrong reasons. And that happens with everybody, including Israel itself. But I'm going to start with a Palestinian example first. Back in September of 2007, the Palestinian committee in charge of the Temple Mount maintenance, known as the Waqf, under the general supervision of the Jordanian government. This is a deal we struck with Jordan a long time ago. In fact, even before we had a peace treaty with Jordan. It was decided that some tunnels needed to be run to put in electrical lines and drainage and everything else, to a certain extent modernizing things. The net result was that they backhoed a whole bunch of areas with absolutely no regard for the archaeology. And the surplus dirt, dust, rocks, and artifacts were trucked off to an area on the other side of the Kidron Valley. Now, the artifacts that were there included some of the things I just talked about a few minutes ago, including tiles from the 1st century that were used, stone tiles, sectile tombs in the tiles in the Roman terminology, that were used to decorate the floors and walls of the Stoa, the area we just virtually walked through a few minutes ago. So there was a plus and a minus here. The whole archaeological context was destroyed, but the artifacts put in a dump were taken, since they were considered trash by the Waqf, they were taken by Israeli archaeologists and sifted. And that's led to discoveries that further confirm the existence of Herod's temple and its glorious beauty. So the Waqf may have wanted to improve things, at least in terms of basic services, but we got some knowledge out of it. Unfortunately, there's a problem with all of this. By the international agreement that was confirmed with the Waqf, it was agreed that neither Israelis nor Palestinian archaeologists would interfere with the existing situation on the Temple Mount. And on top of that, it was understood that no tunneling under the Temple Mount would be undertaken. So this rule lasted for a while, but not forever. Anyway. Then there is perhaps the more important branch of all of this, the Emek Tzurim sifting project, which is a continuation, actually it started a little earlier, an offshoot of a project generated by another Waqf construction job. The Waqf decided that there needed to be a large underground prayer hall on the Temple Mount. And so they completely cleared it out, this area known as Solomon's Stables. And let's see if I can show you about where that is. That would be right about here, just below the word Aqsa. And this area, which archaeologists know as Solomon's Stables, although Solomon didn't build it. It was probably Herodian. They really cleared it out, and they sent all of the detritus out to the trash, if you will, where, again, Israeli archaeologists would be digging away, trying to find evidence of at least Herod's temple, but they found evidence of things even earlier from the First Temple period that are very suggestive. But the real issue here is that when the Waqf cleared this area to build this, I believe it's called the Marwan. Maybe that's in the next slide. I finished this some time ago. Let's see if I can go a bit further. No, not quite. We'll go back. In the Marwan area, the finds were sifted through, and as I mentioned before, a good many discoveries, mostly from the Second Temple period, but some that are datable to the First Temple period, continue to strengthen our understanding that the Temple Mount really was the location of our temples. Now, exactly where on the Temple Mount, as I noted before, there are a couple of theories about that. But there you go. Now, the consequence of building this prayer hall, and it is very large and it's largely underground, is that the southeastern corner of the old city walls began to buckle. Well, that's a problem. And they almost collapsed. And one of the things that, from my standpoint, tends to irritate me is that everybody knew that the excavation right up against that wall was what was weakening it. It almost collapsed. And the Waqf said, oh, it's all the Israelis' fault. Well, no, it wasn't. But at the same time, when you know you're guilty, it's very easy to blame somebody else. So that's the Palestinian side of the story, or at least it's a piece of it. But it's not that we are completely guilt-free on our side, and that's what I'm going to be touching on in a bit. I've taken one of my tour groups to Emek Surim, where Gabi Barkai, there he is at the top, directs the sifting. In fact, yes, I'm at the bottom with my friend Fred, my daughter Katie, who came with me a second time to Israel, and some of the archaeologists who are working on it. Barkai's sifting project has actually come up with a fair amount of evidence of very small artifacts that are datable to the First Temple period. So something was going on up there. They didn't find any blocks, building blocks from Solomon's temple, but in any case, even when something negative like that happens, there can be scientific value to it, although it's very damaged because it comes from a site that was completely broken up, trucked down, and disposed of. Then there's the trouble with tunnels. Yeah, we're almost at the end now. The trouble with the tunnels is that the Israelis have become very fond of them. The Ir David excavation area has been funded by a number of groups that are out, not just to prove the Bible, but to prove Israel's right to this land strictly under their control. And if that includes the Palestinian suburb of Silwan, okay, it's going to be taken over. Now that's where a line really needs to be drawn. Some of the ways that we have really gotten ourselves into trouble on this score is that we have built these tunnels, including this one. You virtually walked up this pathway in the video that I showed you, and it would ultimately take you all the way to the southern entrance of the Temple Mount and Robinson's Arch. And now it's becoming another tourist site. The problem is that it has actually caused the sinking and architectural damage of Palestinian houses and other structures directly above. And this complaint has fallen largely on deaf ears. The prime example, though, of where this can really go wrong is the Temple Tunnel, which is a very, very long, mostly narrow passage that will allow you to make your closest approach to the section of the Holy of Holies, they think, of the temple farther up and a bit over. without violating Orthodox strictures about not getting anywhere near the temple area itself, because you're actually below it. The Temple Mount tunnel was opened in 1996. It was early in the premiership of first premiership of Benjamin Netanyahu, who is now forming a new government. And the mayor at the time was Ehud Olmert, who would later become, in the early 2000s, the prime minister of Israel, and then be voted out, and then ultimately spend some time in prison for some illegal money activities. All that aside, Netanyahu was really gangbusters on excavating this temple, because it would allow you to walk right up against the huge retaining wall stones that Herod's builders had established. And it really is some sight, I can't deny it. But when the Temple tunnel was opened, it exited into the Arab quarter. And Netanyahu, a little more reluctantly, Olmert, sold the Arab quarter residents, Palestinians, on the idea that they'd get thousands and thousands of tourists walking by their shops. Well, the Palestinians had a different attitude about it. And as soon as this passage was opened in 1996, riots broke out and 60 people ended up dying. Most of them, but not all of them, Palestinians, because they really felt that this was breaching their neighborhood by tourists that they knew would be mostly Jewish. But it's one of those things that leaves a very bitter memory in not only my eyes, but my mind, but also many Israeli archaeologists who felt this was going a step too far. And that's why we have Emek Shaveh. Emek Shaveh comes from a very obscure passage in the book of Genesis, where Avram and Melchizedek and the king of Sodom get together and negotiate a peace deal. It ultimately created an idiomatic phrase in modern Hebrew that we know as lehagia le'emek shaveh. In other words, to reach a compromise, although it's really the valley of Shaveh. And from the biblical perspective, but it came to be known as the place of compromise. And so Emek Shaveh is an organization of Israeli archaeologists who are committed to the task of trying to find a way of excavating this area without making the local Palestinian population feel that they're about to be evicted for the good of greater Israel and the proof of the Israelite presence there. Emek Shaveh is doing a great job, but it's fighting an uphill battle because there are many organizations, not only extremely conservative Jewish organizations, but evangelical Christian organizations that are putting an enormous amount of money into these kinds of digs. And there are consequences for that. And the consequence that's most concerning is, can you use archaeology to prove that you have a superior right to the land over someone else? It's a great question. And as an archaeologist, I love what we're discovering. But as someone who feels that there needs to be some ethical restraint here, this is very, very troubling. Now, you don't have to agree with me, and I don't expect you to in some cases. But the important point here is that we need to be very sure about why we're digging, as well as what we find when we dig and what we use that information to prove. I mean, take a look at it this way. We know that the indigenous Native American population was here first. So what if the indigenous Native American population said, we were here first, therefore we have full claim to the land. Therefore, all of you immigrants of European origin, get out of here. It's something to consider. Chavez principles are clearly stated, and they really serve an important purpose. I think one of the most important ones for them is point number 5. It is not our business to establish links between modern ethnic identities, that is, Palestinians, Israelis, or European, and ancient ones, Judeans, Canaanites, or Crusaders. We do not use archaeology to prove precedent. That's an incredibly important principle, which increasingly in the 21st century has been largely, if not totally, ignored. No. I met Rabbi Chaim Richman 30 years ago when he was just starting up the Temple Institute. Now, this is just a closing thought. Richman does not believe that we should destroy the Dome of the Rock, although there have been some who have worked towards that very thing for the explicit reason of rebuilding the temple and everything that's associated with that. Rabbi Richman basically says, time will run its course, God will do what God chooses to do, and someday the temple will be rebuilt. Now, take a look at that idea from a Palestinian perspective. The threat, implicit or in a few cases declared, that the third holiest shrine in all of Islam on this planet would be wiped out to reestablish the temple. It's a scary thought. And that is that. So, questions, comments, complaints, you choose it.
Thank you. Thank you for removing that. I appreciate it. Let me look at some. First of all, it's an excellent talk. Thank you. I wish we could all be transported to actually do a walking tour now with you. Questions. Could the only pharaoh who was a monotheist, and I can't pronounce his name.
Akhenaten.
Thank you. Have had an influence on the early Hebrew beliefs?
Great question. And again, one of those that's controversial. I decided to meddle into the muddy world of the politics of biblical archaeology. Well, there's a muddy world in terms of Akhenaten's contribution to monotheism. The short answer is maybe he did, but it was indirect influence. Of that much we can be sure. For example, his great hymn to the Aten, Atel El Amarna, has some phrases that are almost dead ringers for portions of Psalm 104. And that's been trotted out a number of times by everybody since the pioneering American Egyptologist James Henry Breasted brought it out around 1905. Could some aspect of Akhenaten's worship have survived? Indirectly, yes, perhaps through trade with the Phoenicians and then to Israel, because the Phoenicians had a very close cultural and trade relationship with ancient Egypt. But other than that, we don't have the clear connective tissue between the two. What has come up in the last 30 years in the research of Jan Assmann, an Egyptologist from Switzerland, brilliant mind, maybe even right, I don't know. Assmann believes that the memory of Akhenaten was preserved, but Akhenaten's name, since it was obliterated from Egyptian records, we even have Egyptian texts that say that criminal of Akhetaten, that was his capital city, his name must not be mentioned. So Akhenaten's name disappeared, but the Egyptians had such a traumatic experience in the 17 years of his reign that he was always remembered as one who killed off all the gods and goddesses and destroyed Egypt economically. And he probably came pretty close to that. So when proto-Jews began to settle in Egypt, especially after the destruction in 586 BCE, they settled all over ancient Egypt, and they believed in one God. And of course, the native Egyptians at that time still believed in a bunch of gods and goddesses. So a connection was made. The connection was made that, oh, well, the Jews' leader was Moses, and he was the first one to believe in one God. Therefore, our Pharaoh was, our evil Pharaoh was Moses. So in other words, in a case of radical disconnection, a connection was made. It was a false connection, but nonetheless, it's one of these things that, if Osman is right, is critically important to our understanding of religious mismatches. That's about as close as I can come to an answer on that one.
Another question, if the Israelites were really a Canaanite group, who then moved to Egypt and later were led out by Moses?
Okay. Boy, you're all very good at keeping up the controversies. One of the theories that I originally poo-pooed, and now I'm really beginning to think was right, is that the Exodus didn't occur around the time of Ramses II, which is what still a majority of scholars believe. I didn't bring that up in my Ramses II class for the Young Museum folks, but what may have happened here is a distant memory of an earlier, not just event, but process. And this was the invasion of the Canaanite Hyksos, as they were called, into the Egyptian Delta. They controlled the Delta for about 100, 120 years because the native government of Egypt the pharaonic government had collapsed. So they came up with their own government, and they came up with their own Canaanite pharaohs for especially the Eastern Delta part. And it was a fairly successful kingdom, in part because they had conquered a big part of the breadbasket of the Mediterranean world, the Egyptian Delta. A couple of the kings actually had Semitic family names like Jacob or Jacob, not our Jacob, but someone with the same name. And at the very, very beginning of the 18th dynasty, around 1550, 1540 BCE, a native dynasty from the south of Egypt came up, fought against the Hyksos, and kicked them out. In other words, the Hyksos had to make their exodus back home. But while that piece of evidence has some value, what do we say about the tribes? How can we identify them? At this point in history, we have no evidence of the named 12 tribes of Israel. And by this point in history, I mean the 16th century BCE. It's only later that we begin to get some solid evidence. My basic feeling is that the Exodus is a composite of a number of historical events going through a few centuries that, through the telescoping of history, are joined together in a semi-historic mythos that is our story of the Exodus. So then the question is, what part of it can we really lock into as history? Some of it I think we can, but we don't have the details yet.
Someone writes about the Western Wall Tunnel, the criticism about this tunnel, that it undermined the Temple Mount and the Dome of Rock, while the writing started with the tunnel opening at the Christian Quarter. The person writes, he was there at the time. Quote, this criticism was not true since the tunnel did not go under the Temple Mount.
No, it did not go under the Temple Mount, nor was it something that in any serious way structurally weakened the area directly above. In that respect, I was speaking of the more recent tunneling area that follows that path up to the Southern Temple Mount area, where apparently there has been some damage done to the modern buildings above. That doesn't change the fact that when the Temple Tunnel was opened, it did lead to rioting and a good many people died. And it was something that needed to be very carefully considered before that happened.
Just a question for those who may be planning to go to Israel. If you can name 2 or 3 archaeological sites, historic sites that you would not miss, but not from the past 500 years, but
Yeah, I know, biblical sites. Oh, that's hard because I love all of them. For the southern end of the country, I would recommend visiting Beersheba and Arad. They're both fairly close. They're both not too far away from the modern city of Arad, modern city of Beersheba. Actually, Arad is a town now as well. And both of them, in terms of archaeological conservation and the clarity of presentation to visitors, are really impressive. Beersheba especially gives you an idea of what life was like during the Judean monarchy, that is, let's say, 800 to 600 BCE. And you can just kind of walk through it and really get a sense of not only the houses that were there, but it also had its own water tunnel, which every self-respecting town of any size would have to have, a stairway down and a tunnel to the water source. So Beersheba is a good choice for that. Arad is a good choice because you can actually visit the early Bronze Age town and also the Israelite fortress town. They're all in the same park. The early Bronze Age site is well worth seeing because it's really one of the few areas that has such extensive remains from that period that are on display. The Iron Age fortress town is important because it actually has a temple dedicated to Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, the god of Israel. And it has some of the features on a much smaller scale that we believe existed with Solomon's temple.
Thank
So
you.
that would be in the south. For the north, Megiddo is a classic and a beautiful place to visit. And again, very nicely conserved. It has its own museum, and so does the northern town of Hatzor. So if I were to give you two sites from the northern kingdom of Israel and two sites from the southern kingdom of Judah, outside of Jerusalem, of course, it'd be Arad and Beersheba in the south and Megiddo and Hatzor in the north. There you go.
That's a hint to everyone to visit Israel. I want to thank you, Jehon. It's been
Sure.
excellent. There is a wonderful trip to Mexico, historic societal trip that Jehon is leading.
I'm helping.
Helping, okay. Go to newlairhouse.org. You can find out more information there and about the Hebrew classes that he'll be speaking in the next semester. On Thursday, in the afternoon at 4 o'clock, we're going to have Ben Matlin talk about his book, Disability Pride. We have a lot coming up. Fred Rosenbaum is going to be speaking of the period around 1919 in Ukraine and the relationship and tensions between ethnic Russians, Ukrainians, many Germans who moved to the area of Ukraine around the end of World War I, and the Jewish community in preparation for the local Jewish film festival showing the Ukrainian film Anton. So that is this coming Sunday at 11 p.m. Yeah, not 11 p.m. That's wrong time. December 11th at 7 o'clock. And Around the World with Fred goes to Ukraine. Thank you again, Jehon, and everyone. Thank you for joining us. Be well, and we'll see you under one tent.
Thank you.